In 1930, a president signed a tariff bill that was supposed to protect American workers and save American factories. Within 2 years, global trade collapsed by 65%. Unemployment in America hit 25%, and the world spiraled into the worst economic depression in modern history. That president was Herbert Hoover. The bill was called the Smoot Hawley Tariff Act, and right now, almost a century later, the United States may be making the exact same mistake. Welcome back to Professor Ashford. This is where we follow the money behind the rise and fall of empires. And today, the money trail leads us somewhere unexpected. Not to a foreign adversary. Not to a distant battlefield. But to the beating heart of American economic power itself, and to a policy that may be quietly dismantling it from the inside. Let us begin with a number. 2.4%. That was the average effective tariff rate in the United States when Donald Trump took office for his second term in January 2025. It was one of the lowest tariff rates in American history. For decades, the United States had championed free trade. It had built a global economic order based on open markets, low barriers, and the free movement of goods across borders. This was not charity, it was strategy. The system made America the center of global commerce. Every trade deal, every shipping route, every financial transaction flowed through American institutions, American banks, and American dollars. The low tariff rate was not a sign of weakness. It was the engine of American dominance. And then, in the span of just a few months, everything changed. By April 2025, the average effective tariff rate in the United States had skyrocketed from 2.4% to an estimated 27%. That was the highest level in over a century. To put that in perspective, you have to go back to the 1890s to find tariff rates that high. In the modern era of global trade, nothing like this had ever been attempted. The United States had essentially thrown a wall around its economy and told the rest of the world to deal with it. The tariffs came in waves. First, it was China. Then Canada and Mexico, America's two largest trading partners and two of its closest allies. Then steel and aluminum from everywhere. Then automobiles. Then a sweeping set of tariffs on April 2, 2025, which the administration called Liberation Day, imposing a minimum 10% tariff on nearly every country on Earth, with rates going as high as 145% on Chinese goods. One after another, the tariffs landed like artillery shells on the global trading system that America itself had built. Now, the stated goal was simple. Bring manufacturing back to America, shrink the trade deficit, force other countries to play fair, and on the surface these goals sound reasonable. After all, the United States does have a massive trade deficit. In 2024, America imported roughly $1.2 trillion more in goods than it exported. Factories had been closing for decades. Manufacturing jobs had moved overseas. Communities across the heartland had been hollowed out. The frustration was real, and the desire to do something about it was understandable. But here is the problem. Tariffs are not free. They are not a magic wand that brings factories back overnight. A tariff is, at its core, a tax. And the question that Professor Ashford always asks is the same question you should ask about any economic policy. Who actually pays? The answer, according to virtually every major economic study conducted over the past year, is that Americans pay. Not the Chinese. Not the Canadians. Not the Europeans. Americans. The Tax Foundation estimated that the tariffs amount to the largest tax increase as a percentage of GDP since 1993. The average American household is paying roughly $1,500 more per year because of these tariffs. And that burden falls hardest on the people who can least afford it. Families in the bottom 20% of income saw their effective tax rate rise by 1.1 percentage points, more than families at the top. Think about that for a moment. A policy designed to help American workers is in practice a regressive tax that hits the poorest Americans the hardest. The factory worker in Ohio who was promised that tariffs would save his job is now paying more for groceries, more for clothing, more for electronics, and more for the car he drives to work. Whether or not his factory survives is still an open question, but his cost of living went up immediately. And the economic damage goes far beyond household budgets. The Yale Budget Lab estimated that all the tariffs enacted in 2025 reduced real GDP growth by nearly a full percentage point. The OECD forecast that American economic growth would slow from 2.8% in 2024 to just 1.6% in 2025 and 1.5% in 2026. The Penn-Wharton budget model at the University of Pennsylvania published one of the most alarming assessments of all. Their projections showed that the tariffs, if maintained at their April 2025 levels, would reduce long-run GDP by about 6% and reduce wages by 5%. A middle-income household would face a lifetime loss of $22,000. And these losses were estimated to be twice as large as the damage caused by raising the corporate tax rate from 21 to 36%, which economists consider one of the most distortionary taxes possible. In other words, the tariffs were doing more damage to the American economy than one of the most aggressive corporate tax increases imaginable. And yet, they were sold as a tool of economic empowerment. But the domestic damage is only half the story, because tariffs do not exist in a vacuum. When the United States raises tariffs on its trading partners, those partners respond. And respond they did. Canada, which shares the largest bilateral trading relationship with the United States, hit back with 25% retaliatory tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, later expanding to 155 billion. The Canadian Prime Minister declared that the 80-year era in which the United States championed free trade and forged alliances rooted in trust and mutual respect was over. Not paused, over. Canada's economy contracted by 1.6% in the second quarter of 2025, largely due to falling exports. Its unemployment rate climbed above 7%. Canadian businesses reported losing 50% of their American customers as supply chains were ripped apart. And Canada was supposed to be America's friend. This was not an adversary. This was the country that shares the longest undefended border in the world with the United States, the country that has fought alongside America in nearly every major conflict of the past century, the country that sends more oil to the United States than any other nation on earth. And overnight, it was treated like an economic enemy. The pattern repeated itself around the world. China retaliated with tariffs exceeding 100% on some American goods. The European Union, after initially trying to negotiate, was hit with a 30% tariff and began preparing its own countermeasures. Japan negotiated a deal, but still faced tariffs of 15% on its exports. Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, all of them absorbed tariffs and all of them either retaliated or began looking for alternative trading partners. And this is where the historical parallel becomes impossible to ignore. In 1930, President Herbert Hoover signed the Smoot Hawley Tariff Act. It raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods by an average of about 20%. The goal was identical to what we hear today. Protect American workers, save American farms, shield American industry from foreign competition. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition begging Hoover not to sign the bill. He signed it anyway. Within months, Canada retaliated. France retaliated. Spain retaliated. Britain retaliated. One by one, America's trading partners threw up their own walls. Global trade collapsed by 65% between 1929 and 1934. American exports fell from $7 billion to $2.5 billion. Farm exports dropped by a third. Unemployment, which was 8% when the bill was signed, jumped to 16% the following year and hit 25% by 1932. Smoot Hawley Tariff did not cause the Great Depression. The Depression was already underway when the bill was signed, but it made it dramatically worse. It turned a domestic financial crisis into a global economic catastrophe. And it taught a generation of American leaders, both Republican and Democrat, a lesson that lasted for 80 years. Do not start a trade war, because trade wars have no winners. That lesson held through the Cold War, through the creation of the World Trade Organization, through NAFTA, through the rise of China as a trading power. Every American president from Roosevelt to Obama, regardless of party, understood that the global trading system was not a burden on America. It was the foundation of American power. And yet, in 2025, that lesson was abandoned. Not because the economic evidence had changed. Not because some new theory had emerged to justify protectionism. But because the political incentives had shifted. Tariffs are easy to explain. Trade deficits are easy to point to. And the pain of globalization, the closed factories, the lost jobs, the hollowed-out towns, that pain is real and visible. The benefits of free trade, lower prices, more choices, stronger alliances, higher growth, those benefits are diffuse and invisible. You do not notice the things that are cheaper because of open trade, but you absolutely notice when your factory closes. So here we are. Let us look at where things stand in early 2026 and ask the question that Professor Ashford always asks. Follow the money. Who is winning and who is losing? The trade deficit, which the tariffs were supposed to fix, barely moved. According to the Tax Foundation, the total trade deficit fell by only $2.1 billion in 2025. That is a rounding error on a $1.2 trillion deficit. The deficit in goods actually persisted while the surplus in services provided the only marginal improvement. The tariffs did not fix the trade deficit because the trade deficit is not caused by tariffs or the lack thereof. It is caused by macroeconomic forces, the fact that Americans consume more than they produce, and that foreign capital flows into the United States to finance that gap. You cannot fix a macroeconomic imbalance with a microeconomics tool. That is like trying to drain the ocean with a bucket. Manufacturing output did expand. The Yale Budget Lab found that U.S. manufacturing grew by about 3.2% in the long run under the tariff regime. But those gains were more than offset by contractions in other sectors. Construction output fell by 4.3%. Mining and extraction declined by 2.1%. Agriculture fell by 1.3%. The tariffs did not grow the economy. They reshuffled it, taking from some sectors to give to others, and shrinking the overall pie in the process. The federal government did collect significant revenue. Customs duties brought in $264 billion in 2025, compared to $79 billion the year before. But then the Supreme Court struck down the majority of the tariffs. In February 2026, in a 6-3 ruling, the court declared that the president had exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Government had collected roughly $166 billion in tariffs that were now ruled illegal, collected from over 330,000 businesses. Those businesses are now entitled to refunds. The government essentially has to give back the money it collected under an authority it never had. The administration responded immediately by invoking a different law, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, to impose a new 10% global tariff. This law had never been used before. It allows the president to impose tariffs for only 150 days, and it was designed for short-term monetary emergencies, not permanent trade policy. 24 states immediately sued to block the new tariffs, arguing that the administration was simply looking for legal loopholes to continue a policy that the highest court in the land had already rejected. And here is the part that should concern every American, regardless of political affiliation. The damage done by the tariffs is not just economic, it is strategic. For 80 years, the United States maintained a network of alliances and partnerships that gave it extraordinary global influence. NATO, the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, trade agreements, military bases, diplomatic relationships, All of these were built on a foundation of trust. America's allies accepted American leadership because they believed, with good reason, that America would not use its economic power as a weapon against them. That trust is now broken. Canada, America's closest ally, is actively diversifying its economy away from dependence on the United States. The Canadian Prime Minister explicitly stated that the old relationship of deepening integration with America is finished. Europe is accelerating its push for energy independence and defense autonomy, having concluded that it cannot rely on American commitments. Japan, South Korea, and Australia are all recalibrating their strategic positions. Even countries that signed trade deals with the Trump administration are hedging their bets, building new relationships with China and other powers just in case. And China, the country these tariffs were primarily aimed at, is watching all of this with patience. Chinese GDP growth slowed slightly, but its economy is about 0.2% smaller in the long run from the tariffs, a manageable cost for a country of its size. Meanwhile, as America alienates its allies, China is positioning itself as an alternative partner. It is deepening relationships in Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. Every time the United States slaps a tariff on a friend, China sends a trade delegation. This is the pattern that historians recognize. Empires do not collapse because of external enemies. They collapse because they undermine the very systems that made them powerful. Spain destroyed itself with gold, flooding its economy with precious metals from the Americas until inflation ate it alive. Britain destroyed itself with debt, fighting wars it could not afford and clinging to an empire it could no longer maintain. The Soviet Union destroyed itself with central planning, trying to control every aspect of its economy until the system seized up and died. And now the United States, the country that built the most successful global trading system in human history, the country that became the world's dominant superpower precisely because it championed open markets and attracted the world's capital, talent, and trade. That country is systematically dismantling the very architecture of its own power. The tariffs have not brought back the factories. They have not closed the trade deficit. They have not made America richer. What they have done is raise prices for American families, slow economic growth, alienate America's closest allies, empower its chief rival, trigger a constitutional crisis between the executive branch and the Supreme Court, and create a level of economic uncertainty that is making businesses afraid to invest higher or plan for the future. The Federal Reserve's own Beige Book, published in early 2026, confirmed that economic growth was muted as tariffs increased costs for businesses, many of which passed those costs directly to consumers. Companies reported difficulty planning because they had no idea what the tariff rate would be next month, let alone next year. Investment decisions were delayed. Hiring was frozen. The uncertainty itself became a drag on growth, separate from and in addition to the direct cost of the tariffs. Now, let me be clear about something. Professor Ashford does not take political sides. This channel is about economics, history, and the flow of money. And the economic evidence on tariffs is not a matter of political opinion. It is a matter of historical fact. Every major episode of protectionism in modern American history has ended badly. The tariffs of the 1890s led to economic stagnation. Smoot Hawley in 1930 helped deepen the Depression. The steel tariffs of 2002 were abandoned after just 21 months because they were destroying more jobs than they were saving. The question is not whether tariffs cause economic damage. They do. The question is whether the damage is worth the political benefit. And that is a question that each voter has to answer for themselves. But they should answer it with their eyes open, knowing the full cost. Because if history has taught us anything, it is this. The most dangerous moment for any empire is not when it is attacked from outside. It is when it turns its weapons inward. When it begins to see its own trading partners as enemies. When it mistakes self-isolation for self-reliance. When it tears up the alliances and agreements that took decades to build, believing it can go it alone. Every empire that has ever gone down this road has arrived at the same destination, not overnight, not in a dramatic collapse, but slowly, steadily, one tariff at a time, one broken alliance at a time, one lost opportunity at a time, until one day the world has moved on, and the empire that thought it was protecting itself discovers that it has only been hollowing itself out. Whether the United States follows that path or changes course is the defining economic question of our time. And the answer will not be found in the tariff rates or the trade deficit numbers. It will be found in whether America remembers the lesson that Herbert Hoover learned too late, the lesson that 1,000 economists tried to teach him in 1930, and the lesson that Professor Ashford will keep teaching as long as this channel exists. Tariffs are not shields. They are walls. And walls do not just keep things out. They also lock you in. Thank you for watching. If this video helped you understand the real economics behind the tariff debate, subscribe to Professor Ashford and hit the notification bell so you never miss a class. If you want to see how other empires destroyed their own economies from within, check out the videos linked on screen right now.